For this second video in a series I'm making on COVID and COVID restrictions, I wanted to ask the question, should we be asking our politicians, our leaders, our health officials to disclose both sides of the balance sheet? What I mean by that is quite simple. We've pretty much all been living through a pandemic for almost a year, and we've all had, depending on where we live, a series of restrictions of different levels in different regions, provinces, states, countries in Europe. And what we have is we have these politicians and these health officials coming in front of us and saying, our prediction is that if we do not impose this lockdown or that lockdown for 4 weeks, that X people will die from the virus. And that if we do impose it, we can reduce that to Y. And whether or not these forecasts have been effective is one thing that can certainly be brought into question. But more generally, this then leads us as someone who is ingesting this news to think, okay, well, I want to have fewer people die from COVID rather than more, so I'm okay with the restrictions. The reality is, at least in economics, probably for the most part of life, that there is very little that is free. When you impose restrictions on a region, on a state, on a province, you're also going to have some negative effects. And these kinds of negative effects can't be likened to, for example, imagine if you ask someone to look both ways before crossing the street. This makes them safer, reduces the chance they're going to be hit by a car. And the amount of time, in other words, the cost of looking both ways is so small, so insignificant, that most people should be looking both ways before they cross the road. But with this pandemic, and since it's dragged on for almost a year now, the restrictions that we've seen have a cost that is quite a bit higher than simply looking both ways. These costs can be obviously in mental health going down, which can be seen in both depression and suicides, overdoses as well, business closures, worsened educational attainment, also just general unhappiness, also less health from people who aren't playing as much sports, going to the gym as much. People might be less healthy physically as well as mentally. We have a bunch of different costs, and I think that it's accepted generally that these costs are real, although the extent to which they are great or small is up for debate. Imagine if the head of your state, the premier of your province, whoever gives those big presentations that you always dread, where they go in front of you and they say, well, the numbers have risen and we have to impose X and X restrictions, and doing so will save 100 lives, 1,000 lives, 10,000 lives. What would we, the public, think if instead of just giving that one side of the equation, they were also to go up there and say, on the other hand, we do predict that the number of suicides this year because of this will increase by 20, 40, whatever it is, or that the instances of depression will increase by this much, or that on average students will lose X years in terms of educational attainment, or that X number of businesses will have to shut down because of this and people will lose their jobs. If we were to present this information, or even though we understand that it's very hard to make these predictions, to the public every single time that these leaders come in front of us and make these decisions to go into various forms of a lockdown, would we still be in lockdown? I mean, for the average person, I imagine that is working or isn't working and is therefore super stressed about not being able to work, who has to take care of their family and take care of their own mental health. They're not going and they're not reading on every single number and following all the different charts and getting the full picture of what's happening. they're really just there, and when the local politician or health official comes on the news, they will watch him or her, and they'll listen and they'll go, oh, okay, and they'll go along in general with what's being said. But I'm not certain that they're always being presented a completely fair representation of what the effects of these policies, these restrictions will be. So I can think of many people that I know that theoretically would be horrified at the idea that, for example, where I live, it's possible that at the end of next week, we will have a number of restrictions kept in place between essentially for all of February. And I can only imagine some people being absolutely horrified at the idea of our premier going up and saying, we think it's necessary, it's for the best, but for the record, these are the costs. Maybe 50 people will commit suicide that wouldn't otherwise have, or maybe 500 businesses will go bankrupt that shouldn't have, and these 2,000 people will lose their jobs, whatever it is. We'll have to raise taxes for a decade starting next year because of this. I'm not saying these are necessarily the costs. I don't know the numbers myself, as I'm not an official in the government, and it takes quite a bit of effort to do this amount of research. What would we think? Where would we be as a society if that were the way information is represented? Instead, I find that most people are either getting the biggest side of the picture, which is that they believe that the lockdowns are pretty much a minor inconvenience or a moderate inconvenience that isn't really doing that much damage, but that there is simply no way for them to be doing more damage than they are curing or saving us from. And there's also a minority of people who tend to be anti-lockdown or anti-restrictions, who might completely poo-poo all of the benefits of a lockdown. Very few people seem to go and fit somewhere in the middle and say, there are benefits to this. There are certain situations in which certain restrictions can be useful, but that we have to be aware of every single side of it. It's very tough. I can't imagine a politician doing that for the simple reason that it would not play very well with the public to tell them that you are going to cause business closures because of your actions, but that it's for the right, it's for the overall good of the populace. In a way, I could imagine even that you have a situation where something is really, whether it isn't in this particular situation with COVID or not, but in a theoretical situation, it is for the overall benefit of the populace to have some sort of restriction or policy, but that fairly and impartially presenting the costs and benefits will still get the population to go out in the street and immediately start rioting and burn everything down because they hate what you just proposed. What does that mean about us? And what should we do in the future when we have more and more situations like this? Now that we have so many computers and televisions and smartphones in every single person's home, on their body pretty much 24 hours a day, and we have this ability to give them, us, I say as a people and as a government, to give them information in almost any format that they want. How should we do this in the future? And where should we go from here? I don't have the answer. But I hope that if only by making this video I either helped myself form a bit better in my head what I think about this, or at least spurred some kind of thought or discussion from anyone who might have seen this. I'm going to make another video in the next couple of days, and the topic on that is going to be on coming public with being, to a certain extent, skeptical about lockdowns and restrictions, and how I feel that a certain stigma has impeded the way some people might actually otherwise be expressing their opinions, their honest opinions on the matter. Thank you for listening.